What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, I'm showing you a crazy game where Magnus Carlsen invents a brand new chess opening that I'm calling the Bongcloud Gambit, and you're about to find out why. And by the way, this game did take place in July 2023 in the Title Tuesday tournament. And here we go. In the game, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white, and of course, he opens with the move 1f3, the Bongcloud style move, potentially intending king to f2 on the next move. We'll have to wait and see what he does. Now here's opponent Maxim. He goes d5, breaking in the center, a very classical move. And now Magnus, instead of going king to f2, he actually does mirror black, and he goes d4, gaining space in the center. A very interesting choice. And now we have some sort of weird d4, d5 opening, where Magnus also has the extra move f3 inserted. All right, now Maxim, he breaks on the queen side with the move c5, the typical queen's gambit move. Now he is putting a lot of pressure on that pawn on d4. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing to defend? Well, you can defend with, say, c3 or e3 or so on. But instead here, Magnus being the GOAT, he finds the strongest move in this position. And by the way, this is a move that has never been played before in the history of chess. And yes, Magnus, he does gain space in the center with the move e4, challenging white's or black's pawns on d5 and c5. And yes, this is a brand new chess opening, and I'm calling this the Bongcloud Gambit, as here white is literally sacrificing a pawn. Here's how it works. Black can take on e4, d takes e4, and then if white recaptures f takes e4, then either c takes or queen takes would win a pawn on the spot. So here white is committed to giving up a pawn to fight for the center, hence the Bongcloud Gambit. All right, now black in this position, the strongest move actually is simply d takes e4, taking up the challenge. And in response, white would have to go d5, trying to keep the center closed and making it an official gambit. However, instead in the game, he doesn't find that move. And he also doesn't find the other playable ideas like, for example, knight c6 and e6. Instead, he plays a very weak, very provocative move, perhaps trying to rattle Magnus Carlsen after his new opening. He actually goes e5. And now we have just a ridiculous amount of tension in the center. All of these pawns attacking each other. It's just getting crazy. All right, Magnus, he finds the strongest move here. Simply d takes e5, capturing that weak pawn on the 5 square. And now he will have attacking chances on the king side. For example, you can see if he goes f4 in the future, maybe knight f3, queen h5 could be an option, and so on. Now here, black, his best bet is to go knight to e7. The point being, if white takes on d5, then you can recapture with the queen and have an okay game. But instead here, d4 is the move, trying to keep the center closed. And here, Magnus, he just goes into beast mode immediately. He starts with the move f4, freeing up the queen to go to h5. And now his plan is queen to h5, bishop c4, and then threatening queen takes f7 with the scholar's mate. Of course, his opponent will spot this, but still, even if you see it coming, this is an incredibly difficult plan to stop, as that pawn on e5 does control the f6 square, and knight to f6 is not possible. Therefore, it's almost impossible to stop the idea of queen to h5 on the next move. All right, here, black, what's it going to be? He has many different playable ideas. For example, f6, f5, and even queen to h4, hitting the king on e1 are all playable. But instead, the move is g5, an absolutely ludicrous move, counterattacking on the king side, and the center is about to be blown open. All right, now Magnus, he ignores the threat and just goes bishop c4, continuing with his scholar's mate plan of bishop c4, queen to h5, and then queen takes f7. Now here, Maxim, he does take on f4, g takes f4, and Magnus swings out the Hikaru queen, queen to h5, targeting f7, and again, that would be mate. It's only move 7, and Magnus Carlsen is threatening checkmate in one move. So with that in mind here, he has to find some way to defend that f7 pawn. Now your options here include knight to h6. That knight would be defended by the bishop, and beyond that, queen e7 and queen c7 both defend f7 as well. Now in the game, queen to e7 is the move, defending with the queen, a perfectly fine idea. But now Magnus, he just picks up that pawn on f4. Bishop takes f4, defending e5, and the bishop is quite active. And here Magnus does have quite a large advantage. Even after his Bongcloud Gambit opening, he finds himself up a pawn in the middle game. All right, black, bishop e6, a solid move, challenging that bishop on c4. That bishop is just too dangerous to be kept alive. All right, knight to a3, defends the bishop, an interesting move, and now that knight also has access to the b5 square in the future if it wants it, And from there, it is eyeing both d6 and c7. Those could be very weak squares in the future, so knight to a3, a subtle but very dangerous move by Magnus. All right, now Maxim, knight to c6, a solid move developing the queen side. And now we have bishop to g5, challenging the queen on the e7 square. The queen does slide over to d7, queen d7, and now Magnus just goes knight to f3, developing his last minor piece. And now let's just slow down and pause and appreciate this weird Bongcloud Gambit middle game position. Here, Magnus, all of his pieces are just so well placed. The knights on f3 and a3, the bishop on c4 slicing down the board, the Hikaru queen on h5 targeting f7, the bishop on g5 preventing long castles. I mean, all of Magnus Carlsen's pieces here are just coordinating perfectly, and beyond that, he can castle on the queen side or the king side, depending on what he wants to do. Now here, black, the move is knight g to e7, supporting his center and also blocking this diagonal. That means long castles is a legal move on the next move if he wants it. But here, Magnus is not slowing down. He jumps in with the knight to b5, giving up that bishop on c4. Now the threat is knight to d6. So if black takes that bishop, he goes knight d6, hits the king must move, then you recapture the bishop, you regain the lost piece, and black's king will be stuck on d8. It cannot castle, so that would be very dangerous. Now here, instead, the move in the game is knight to g6, kind of a weird square for the knight, an interesting idea. And now Magnus, he finally trades on e6. Bishop takes and then f takes. Of course, bishop takes c4 was a real threat, as the bishop now covers d6. Therefore, that trade was required by Magnus. And now here, he has the option of just castling on the king side or the queen side. Both those moves are very playable, but he's not done harassing his weaker opponent. He goes bishop to f6, putting pressure on that rook on h8. In the game, rook g8 is the move, and now surprisingly, the rook is relatively active on this soon-to-be semi-open g-file after the knight moves later in the game. Now here, Magnus, he does castle on the king side. Short castles is the move, giving black the option of castling long later in the game once this diagonal is covered. And then we could have an opposite sides castling scenario, so that potentially being one of the reasons why Magnus did castle on the king side, despite black having that rook on g8 lining up with the king. I mean, Magnus here, he wants a fight. He knows he can win no matter what. All right, bishop e7 is the move, finally clogging up that diagonal. And here, Magnus, before taking on e7, he does jump in with the knight to d6. Crazy idea. The point being, if you take the knight on d6, you have to give up your precious dark squared bishop, and then the bishop on f6 does cover d8 once again, stop playing long castles. So instead of that, here black just goes king to d8, the artificial castling move, perhaps intending king c7 next. All right, here Magnus, queen takes h7. He takes the free pawn, and black does go king c7, completing the artificial castling of the king. Now here, Magnus, bishop takes e7, then knight takes, and then knight to f7. What is the point of this move? To be honest, I'm not completely sure. If you do know, let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to know the point of this weird move right here by Magnus. All right, here, Maxim, king d6. He continues to march his king away from the center of the board. What is the king doing there? I mean, that wasn't required. You could just go, say, rook a to e8, then say king b8, and so on. But Maxim, he's having quite a bit of fun with this Bongcloud Gambit game as well. All right, Magnus, knight 3 to g5, jumping in with the knight, putting pressure on that pawn on e6. Now we have knight to c6, queen to h3, Magnus lining up the pressure once again with that weak pawn. And now we have knight g takes e5, Maxim finally winning a pawn. Now the knights do trade. We have knight takes, then knight takes, and then queen b3 check. The queen flying over, hitting the king. The king's got to go somewhere. In the game, Maxim, he doesn't retreat. King c7 would make the most sense, at least to me, you know, to my amateur mind here. But instead, Maxim, king to a6. What is he doing with the king there? I mean, this game just gets weirder and weirder. And now, of course, that pawn on e6 is hanging. Queen takes e6 is an option. That would get the queens off the board. But of course, Magnus, he wants those queens on the board as long as he can. He wants to attack. So with that in mind, knight takes e6. And now the threat is knight takes c5, forking both the queen on d7 and the king on a6. That would be just game over on the spot. You can't allow that. So with that in mind, b6 is the move, defending c5. But Magnus Carlsen, he doesn't care. He takes c5 anyway. knight takes c5 is the move, sacrificing the knight. And no, this was not a mistake. This turns out to be quite a decent idea. The point being, after b takes c5, that of course is forced if you don't want to lose the queen on d7. Then the move is rook to f6, the deflection sacrifice, taking on c5 to deflect the pawn off the b file, off b6, opening up the 6th rank to the king. Now here, knight to c6 blocks the check, but rook a to f1 activates the other rook on the f file. Of course, though, you can't count black out. He's got pressure on the g file, but beyond that, here, black, he's down to 2 seconds left on the clock. This game is going to be crazy. All right, rook a to b8 pressures the queen, and here Magnus, in time pressure himself, he makes a big mistake. Queen to d5. It turns out after the queen trade, black is going to be doing just fine. That was not necessary. For example, you could just go queen to a4, hitting the king, pressuring the knight on c6, pressuring the queen via the x-ray attack, and so on. But instead, queen takes d5. Now the queens come off, queen takes and e takes, and now we have something resembling an even endgame. Of course, that knight on c6 is doomed. That was one of the points. But here, black, he has those strong pawns on c5 and d4, and that will give him counterplay. All right, here, Maxim, he doesn't even bother defending the knight. Instead, rook takes b2, activating his rook. Maxim knows in rook endgames, you must have your rooks as active as possible. And now the potential threat is, say, rook takes c2, then rook takes g2, then rook takes h1, and then finally rook to g2. That could be checkmate. So Magnus here has to be incredibly careful. All right, rook takes c6, wins the knight. Then king b5, marching the king down the board. Now we have a4, hitting the king by Magnus. Now king to c4, and then here, the best move for Carlsen is going to be rook to f2, defending that pawn on c2. And of course, if rook b1, you just go back to the first rank. But instead, here, the move is d6. Magnus Carlsen pushing his pawn down the board, and this is yet another big mistake. Now, rook takes c2, and believe it or not here, Maxim, he is threatening checkmate. The idea, once again, rook takes g2, king h1, rook takes h2, king g1, and then finally rook to g2, and that would be checkmate with the 2 rooks hovering over the king. So with that in mind here, Magnus, g3 is the move, giving his king some space. But now king d5, getting out of the way of his pass pawn on the c file and pressuring the rook. The rook must move. Rook to a4, pressuring a7. But now Maxim, rook d8, threatening simply rook takes d6. All right, rook f5 hits the king. King to e4. Maxim marching his king down the board. That king will be escorting these 2 protected pass pawns on the e file and the d file and the c file. Now rook to f4 hits the king once again. King to e3, and now there is no rook f3 check, as the rook would be undefended. Therefore, Magnus does take that pawn on a7. Rook takes a7, and of course now both sides in extreme time pressure. Maxim once again down to 2 seconds, and Magnus only has 6 seconds himself. All right, d3, pushing the pass pawn. Pass pawns must be pushed. Now we have rook to e7, hits the king. King d2, then d7. Magnus is now threatening ideas like, say, rook f7, then rook to e8, and he would have that pawn promoting one way or another. All right, here, Maxim, the key move, the winning idea is going to be king to c1. The king will escape over to the queen side, and you are threatening d2 and d1, but in time pressure, he doesn't play that. He plays the move c4, pushing his other pass pawn, but the advanced pass pawn was the bigger priority, and here that move is a little bit slow, and here Magnus Carlsen finds the key idea, simply rook d4, taking advantage of the fact that the c-pawn no longer controls the d4 square. All right, king to c3 hits the rook, but then we have rook d6 defending that pawn, and once again the threat is rook to e8. That would win the rook one way or another. All right, d2 pushing the pawn, rook to e3 hits the king, king b2, then rook to e8. Magnus finishing his plan. Now rook takes and rook takes. Maxim had to give up the rook for the pawn, but now rook c1 is the king, king f2, and d1. Maxim gets a queen of his own. Now we have rook takes and rook takes, and now we have a rook and pawn endgame where, yes, Magnus is up 2 pawns. He has the 2 extra pawns on the king side, but very importantly, this pawn on the c file is so far advanced, and the king is ready to escort it down the board. That means this pawn will promote sooner or later, and Carlsen will have to give up his rook for that pawn, and that means sooner or later, it's going to be the one rook versus 3 pawns of Magnus. All right, here, rook b8, it's the king, then king to a3, rook c8, hits the pawn, king b3, king to e3, and then c3. The pawn's going down the board. Now h4. Magnus getting his alpha 0 h-pawn into the game finally. Now we have rook to e1. It's the king to f4, and then c2. Now here, Maxim is 1 square away from promoting. And of course, rook b8 does nothing, as then king to a2, and the white pawn on a4 blocks the checks on the a file. That means there is no way to stop that pawn from promoting. All right, h5, the alpha 0 h-pawn marches down the board. We have c1, the new queen, rook takes and rook takes, and now we have the 3 pawns of Magnus, soon to be 2 pawns after king takes a4 versus the rook. Who's going to win this endgame? I mean, it is anyone's guess. All right, g4, pushing the pawns down the board. Now we have king takes and h6. Now king to b5. The king must march over to the king side as fast as it can in whatever way it wants to. Now king to f5. Rook to h1, hits the pawn, g5 defends, then king c6. The king march begins. King g6, king d6, king to h7, the right square for the king. Now the threat is g6, g7, and g8 promoting. All right, king e6, g6, rook g1, targeting that weak g-pawn, g7, king to f7, and now that square g8 is covered. But here, Magnus, king to h8, he's playing on rook g6, king to h7, rook g5, and here in this position, Magnus finds maybe the flashiest finish to this game. He does promote the pawn. g8 promotes to a queen. Rook takes is forced, and here in this position, it is a stalemate. White cannot move. His alpha 0 h-pawn on h6 is being blocked. The king cannot go anywhere here. Every square is covered by the rook, and for that reason, we have a stalemate. A draw is achieved by Magnus Carlsen in this crazy game with the new opening. Again, I'm calling the Bongcloud Gambit. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen invents a brand new chess opening against Hans Niemann in the 2024 Speed Chess Championship semifinals. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll love that one as well. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.